Colonel John Henry Patterson was once told a story by a friend that he would never forget. In Palestine, the friend was having a conversation with a fellow Englishman. Through the course of the conversation, Vladimir Jabotinsky was eventually brought up. The Englishman turned to his friend and said, "Oh, you are a follower of Jabotinsky? That's your Churchill." The parallel between Jabotinsky and Churchill was truly striking. Both Vladimir Jabotinsky and Winston Churchill were great writers and famous orators. Both were civilians whose lives were colored by military episodes and a deep interest in war problems. Both spent the major part of their lives in opposition. Both had the foresight and the prophetic power to foretell political events, and they both repeatedly warned their people, in vain, against the fatal policies of their mediocre leaders. The Jewish Legion fought against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. The Legion was Jabotinsky's idea and his greatest achievement. Jabotinsky longed for normalcy for his people. That is why he fought so hard for state organization and an army. Jabotinsky was a Zionist. Zionism is a movement that calls for the re-establishment of the Jewish people to their homeland of Palestine, now formerly known as Israel. Vladimir Jabotinsky used World War I to push the Zionist agenda, specifically the creation of a Jewish nation-state through the formation of the Jewish Legion. Jabotinsky had been traveling around Europe when the First World War broke out. As a journalist, his job was to report on the moods and sentiments produced by the war. One day, he saw a poster that declared that Turkey had joined the Central Powers and had begun military operations. Before that fateful morning, Jabotinsky had been merely an observer of the war. He had no reason for wishing triumph to one particular side. But once Turkey joined the war, according to Jabotinsky, became his war. Jabotinsky believed that the only hope for a Jewish home in Palestine laid in the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. At that moment, he conceived the idea of a Jewish fighting force that would participate in Britain's conquest of Palestine. The first experiment of a Jewish fighting force before the creation of the Jewish Legion was the Zion Mule Corps. Among the young people within a refugee camp in Egypt called Gabari, there were several Russian Jews. The terms of a treaty between Russia and Egypt stated that Russia had extraterritorial jurisdiction over all Russian subjects in Egypt, and that these young men were now being recalled back to Russia to join the army. Jabotinsky was determined to prevent the deportation of these Russian Jews, so he created a proposal to create a Jewish legion in Palestine that the Russian refugees could fight in as an alternative to the Russian army. General Maxwell, the commander of a British force in Egypt, turned down his proposal. Maxwell argued that not only would an offensive in Palestine never happen, but that the British army did not admit foreign soldiers. His suggestion instead was the creation of a detachment for mule transport that would be used on some other sector of the Turkish front. Jabotinsky wanted to decline Maxwell's offer, while Joseph Trumpeldor, another Russian Jew, disagreed. So Jabotinsky left for Europe to try to create the Legion elsewhere, while Trumpeldor accepted Maxwell's offer. The Zion Mule Corps went on to fight in the Gallipoli campaign and forever changed Zionism. Trenches or transport, everyone faced the same danger. Every night under bombardment, the muleteers led their loaded mules to the front and back. Those 600 muleteers had opened up a new avenue in the development of Zionist possibilities. Until then, it was impossible to talk about Zionism to even a friendly statesman. But after Gallipoli, all European papers talked about the Jewish unit. All military correspondents devoted a passage and later a page on the Corps. And most importantly, the Zion Mule Corps provided to the rest of the world that Zionism could transform into a factor that could be valuable. The Zion Mule Corps was eventually disbanded. Now, Jabotinsky had to focus on making the Jewish Legion a reality elsewhere. In order to create the Legion, he had to visit Rome, Paris, and London. In the end, Jabotinsky failed to persuade all three. Jabotinsky's 3 consecutive failures caused him to be excommunicated by the European Zionists, who believed that his agitation for a Jewish legion would do nothing but destroy Zionism. After 12 years of national activity, he was treated like an outcast. Jabotinsky returned to London, motivated to succeed in creating a Jewish legion. The hardest aspect of his plan was the Jewish youth. Whitechapel was where he began. Whitechapel was an immigrant district in London that contained a large population of Jewish refugees. When Jabotinsky approached the people of Whitechapel with his plan, he was first met with indifference. People wondered why they should fight for a far-off land like Palestine when they were content where they were. The Jews of Whitechapel had not volunteered for the war because they didn't feel like they had a responsibility to any nation. Most European countries at this time didn't even grant Jews full citizenship. But what they didn't realize was that conscription was coming. So the main source of manpower for Jabotinsky's plan was established. Jabotinsky believed that England would have to fight in Palestine, and that the only way out for Whitechapel's youth was the Legion. After various campaigns to gain recruits in Whitechapel failed, Jabotinsky finally gained some ground after he gained support from the London Times. With the sudden boost of support, Jabotinsky sent a formal petition to Mr. Lloyd George in the British War Cabinet, proposing the creation of a Jewish legion to fight in Palestine. The cabinet considered the petition and approved. The Jewish Legion was born. In August of 1917, the formation of the Jewish Legion was officially announced. Before the fighting began, the Jewish Legion contained 5 battalions, altogether 5,000 men, coming from Britain, Russia, the United States, Greece, Argentina, Egypt, and even Palestine. The military history of the Jewish Legion can be broken into 3 parts: the summer months at the front of Shahim, the Great Offensive in the Jordan Valley, and the Armistice. The first of these periods was moderately quiet. The Legion's front was located midway between Jerusalem and Shahim, between 2 abandoned Arab villages. The distance between the 2 fronts was 2 miles. Every morning the Turks bombarded the Legion, but they always missed. The war conducted in Palestine was regarded as small warfare. The Legion fortunately didn't experience any of the technological advancements used on the western and eastern fronts. The only other real dangers the men faced were night patrol duty and the 7 days watch at Abuin. After a month on the Shahim front and 2 weeks' rest, the Legion was sent to the Jordan Valley. In the middle of August 1918, the Great Offensive began. The climate of the Jordan Valley proved forthright to be the most difficult. The extreme heat made the march to the front and the fighting that took place there almost impossible, and malaria ran rampant in the Legion. During the fighting in Transjordan, more than 20 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Jabotinsky considered the 3rd period of service, the Armistice period, to be the most important, because the main purpose of the creation of the Legion was not so much its participation in the war, but it remaining as a garrison in Palestine after the war. Unfortunately, the Jewish Legion was never the major part of the Army of Occupation in Palestine. It was instead demobilized once the war ended because Britain didn't see a need for it. Jabotinsky tried to fight for its survival, warning that its most important period of existence was now, because a giant campaign of pogrom propaganda had begun in Palestine. The only force that could prevent a pogrom was the Jewish Legion, because of its fearful reputation. But nobody listened, and since the Legion was demobilized, a pogrom did occur a year later in Jerusalem. In the conclusion of his book, Jabotinsky admits that in his memoir, there may have been an error in a date or name, some facts may have been omitted, and that there is bias. Regardless, the Jewish Legion was a true part of the Jewish history, and a noble part at that. But it did have its stains, for according to Jabotinsky, the most beautiful epics of world history had their ugly stains. The Legion played a less significant role in Palestine after the war. While the Legion was still deployed, Palestine enjoyed peace. But once it was demobilized, a series of pogroms occurred first in Jerusalem, then in Jaffa, then in Petach Tikva, and then in Jerusalem again. Jabotinsky didn't win in the end. He dreamt of a Jewish fighting force, an actual army that would be the majority of the occupation force in Palestine after the war, but instead, he got 5,000 men in a legion that fought during the war. But those 5,000 did succeed by playing a decisive part in Zionist history. The most significant role that the legion played was in politics. Although Jabotinsky and his Zionist colleagues abhorred war, they obtained their official right to Palestine as a result of the war. According to Jabotinsky, half of the Balfour Declaration belongs to the Legion, because the Balfour Declaration wasn't given to individuals, it was given to a movement, and Zionism couldn't have expressed itself during the war years without the Legion movement. The Legion showed the world that Zionism was alive and prepared for sacrifice, to treat the striving of the Jewish people for its country as a matter of utmost importance, and that's what the Legion did. In 1937, there was a debate in the House of Commons over the Peel Commission. The commission published a report that suggested a two-state solution in Palestine. Winston Churchill did not favor partition, but once again found himself in opposition, making him unsure if he was going to intervene. Vladimir Jabotinsky sent Churchill a letter, urging him to stand up against the partition. Jabotinsky told Churchill, "You are one of the very limited inner circle of British statesmen responsible for the birth of the Jewish Commonwealth idea between 1917 and 1922, and we expect you to defend it now that it is so dangerously threatened, and would be grievously disappointed if your voice was not heard." Churchill was so impressed by Jabotinsky that a few days later they met for an hour in the House of Commons. Jabotinsky's points made their mark. When the Commons debated the Peel Report on July 21st, Churchill opposed any final commitment to partition. Churchill eventually convinced the Commons to not proceed with the partition by referencing the Balfour Declaration. Churchill argued that Zionism helped win the war for the Allies, and I quote, "We cannot brush that aside and start afresh, as though it had never been given, and deal with this matter as if we had no obligations or responsibility." Churchill was a lifelong ally of Zionism, another similarity he shared with Jabotinsky.